you would have a little register at the back of your checkbook, and you would write a note. Of course, accounting departments have a similar concept where we're keying in the details associated with a transaction so that every transaction has an associated comment. So think of this as the detail level comment when we talk about the description. I also created the concept of an account in this model. So we have basically the checking account showing up here in our first set of rows in this data set. As far as a higher level, we also have basically a bucketing or segment concept. And let's look at that. So I have what are called activity types. You can think of this as accounts. So for example, dining out, grocery, entertainment. These are categories where we want to track our expenses, and more importantly, where we want to establish a budget beforehand so that we can see how well we're tracking to that budget. This is exactly the scenario that's played out in corporate accounting on a daily basis. It's just a simplified version here in this personal finance example. So again, we have our segmentation with what we're calling activity types to basically put all of our transactions into meaningful buckets. Think of them as categories. We have our transactions, which have the detailed amounts, as well as comments and dates. And then I added a general ledger concept as well to this model, and that will give us the ability to do things like show overall account status with a similar concept of a general ledger to what you'd see in a corporation or in any business accounting system where we have accounts that effectively roll up one into another and give us an overall comprehensive view of the enterprise, in this case of our home. I also added a master calendar, and the point of the master calendar in QlikView, and this is a very common construct. I'll just move on after this so that those of you that are familiar with QlikView, we can start looking at some things that might be more interesting. But the master calendar will let us do things like create more interesting buckets associated with periods of time. So we have a year concept, a month concept, a month-year, and I created a period type so we can have a future and a historical way of analyzing the data. And then the activity type is where we actually tie in with our transactions. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of the data that we're looking at. Now let's jump into the dashboard. Now, I've got a couple of views available that I put together within this dashboard, and I want to point out some of the challenges with budgeting and planning. The key activity that happens when you produce a dashboard or a set of reports that visualize the data, and that's, again, the trend that's happening across businesses. Really, everybody is looking to enhance the data by visualizing it. What that does, of course, is it calls out details that should be analyzed more in depth. But it also helps us organize the content in a way that might be thought out in advance so that we're not just looking through a bunch of reports. We're actually sort of scripting, if you will, or creating a narrative behind the data to give it more meaning and more relevancy on an ongoing basis when we pull these dashboards up. Now, the challenge with budgeting and planning is that we want to be able to look at the big picture and very quickly go from there to the details. And so we can see, of course, the devil in the details, right, when we're looking at what has occurred over the prior months. Was there a particular month where we were out of balance and went over budget? Were there particular accounts, or were there particular items? Going back to that concept of a comment, were there particular recurring items that are really biting us and causing our budget to be blown? So again, the trick is going back and forth between the details and the big picture very quickly, and we want to do that, in fact, so quickly and effortlessly that we don't cause the viewer or the user to lose their context. We want them to have very fast interactions here. So I've put together a few examples of how you can accomplish that in QlikView, and QlikView out of the box, of course, does an excellent job of what we would call data discovery. It's known for that. It of course, has out of the box many different constructs from a graphical user interface perspective that really highlight the data and let us interact with it. But there's some things we can do on top of that, and let me just talk about those design concepts here for a moment. So what I've done is I started with upper left-hand corner, and when we think of visualizing data, the upper left-hand corner is, you can think of this as prime real estate. Our eyes, you know, in any culture that reads from left to right, let's qualify it that way, we focus on the top left-hand corner of any screen. That's where our eyes naturally go. So anything we put up here, we want to make sure it's important, relevant, and you know, we don't want to waste that space. So what I've done is I've created our segments up here, or our categories, and we have two things happening in this upper left-hand quadrant. First of all, we've broken out the categories so that we can actually click on them. So we have an interactive capability, but we also have an intelligence role that's being played as well. So we're combining the two together. I'll show you how that works in just a second, but let's just point out, when we talk about the intelligence aspect, here's what we're referring to. We have whether we're on target or not. So if we have a green, of course we're on target, and if we have the warmer color, in this case kind of a red-orange, we're not on target. Target meaning, did we meet our goal or not? Next to that, we're showing the variance. So in the case of entertainment, we were 162% over our budget for the time period that we're looking at. Time period in this case is obvious to the user because it's highlighted up top. We're looking at the year 2011. The user is free to change that time frame by narrowing down the months if they want to do that, or they can just leave that as the entire year, so we have a year-to-date picture. We also have the mini chart, which gives us a very quick glance at the trending of that particular segment. So for example, in the case of travel, it looks like we had some really significant expenses up front. And by the way, one thing to note with this particular utilization of a mini chart is that all of these y coordinates, these y-axis coordinates, share the same axis. So what that means is that when you see a low-hanging line like this, it truly is a low proportional value in the case of miscellaneous versus, say, house expense, which represents a significant, actually the largest proportion of our budget. But, you know, there's two things going on. We're showing, A, that we have a large proportion, and B, that it's fairly steady. So you see these lines are creating a very quick understanding of what's going on with our data. Now, we don't have specific x-axis labels over here, so we can't tell, you know, which month did we drop off, for example, in the case of travel. But it's geared to help us orient ourselves to look into the details. As I mentioned, we want to have some very effortless interaction for the end user to get to those details, and let's start looking at how that works now. So I mentioned dual purpose up at the top left-hand corner. Visualization or intelligence of the data, as well as interaction. So if we click on one of these categories, now what's going to happen is the rest of the dashboard, of course, falls into place, and we're seeing our specific data that's been filtered down to just the travel category. Notice off to the right we have the same trend line, but now it's been fully exploded, so we have our labels, and we're able to look at that in context of our budget. So here's our budget, the dotted line. across all of the months, and then here's our actual expenditures. Notice that we're also, so one of the goals of any visualization is we want to maximize, actually one of the guys on our team came up with a really good term. I'm not sure if he invented it or not, but I think it's a great term, information density. We want to maximize the amount of information within every pixel in the eye's view. So notice how we're using color here to indicate yet another dimension of the data. The red color, of course, shows that we're over budget, and as was the case over here, and the green shows that we were within the budget. Okay, so up top we have a summarized view of that data. So the travel category overall for the overall time period, which is the year 2011, was over budget, and here was the actual numbers. We had $3,200 that we budgeted, but we've spent $4,400, which was a 37% variance. So far, what we've really done is we've zoomed in sort of to a midpoint with what I've focused on so far. We started high level with some sort of auxiliary data points that would help guide our next steps in the analysis. And we've now broken that out to sort of a mid-level analysis by showing the time periods. This way the user can decide, okay, do I want to focus on some specific months where we went out of our budget, or is it perhaps something going on in the details? Well, the details we're now going to explode down here. So we have sort of a multifaceted view, if you will, but still fairly guided. It's fairly easy for the user to orient themselves, across all of these different things or these different components that are doing different things, and still create a common, cohesive story or framework for analyzing this data. But let's talk about what's going on down here at the bottom. This is basically I mentioned the registry or the comments. That's what we're seeing here. Turns out that a lot of comments turn into reusable segments themselves because we end up using the same comment over and over again. In other words, we stayed in a hotel on several different occasions, so that ends up being a bucketing concept for our data. So that's just related, of course, to how you enter your comments or how your accounting department handles your comments. But notice that we have color coding happening down here in the detail view as well. Whenever possible, we want to try to create an understanding using any method we have, and usually that's going to be placement of the data, coloring of the data, or the type of chart that we have at our disposal to create, again, some sort of intelligence, not just showing the data, but the story behind the data, what's happening. And in this case, what I've done is I've color-coded the numbers so that we're first off sorting from highest to lowest, and then what we're doing is we're going to have the numbers that are within budget show up as green, and once we've surpassed our budget, the numbers will start to show up as red. Now this is not, how do you say this? This is not a sort of a hard and fixed business rule that we're displaying here. It's more of a quick information point for the end user to help them, again, sort of understand what's happening with the data. Let me just give you some examples here. If we click on, let's say, entertainment, notice in July, it didn't take much to go over our budget, but you can see that, with the golf that we went out and invested in, we were okay, but it was really the electronics that threw us off. So that's just, again, it's sort of a soft data point. You can take it with a grain of salt. The main point being we're highlighting some additional factors in the data here, i.e. when did we go over the budget. There's different ways of doing that, of course, and I'll walk through how this was done in just a second. What I want to do here for a moment is just show you that there's other views that we can create for the user to get a better understanding. So if we're thinking the way that the end user is thinking as they're going through their data. They're going to focus on, again, what are the interesting areas of analysis at a high level. It might be that they're trying to free up some funds, so let's look at where we're under budget and where that money is going and how far in the budget we are. So we can quickly understand those details by looking off to these charts to the side and below. If the case is that we're trying to understand where we're going over budget, in the case of house expense, it was basically from February through July. We can look down at the details and see what were some of those transactions. Now there's another set of views that we want to be able to provide if additional analysis is needed without, again, the key here is not getting the user lost, not creating a context switch. If you want to put it in sort of computer terminology, context switch, I'm sure most of you are aware, is when a program has to pause in order to factor in incoming information from a different program that's running. Well, that slows the system down, and that's very much the case with our brains as well. Whenever we have to reorient ourselves, it's a context switch. So we want to keep things in place as much as possible. So we do that by creating supporting views that they can click on. So here's a simple register view. All of the same filters are applied, i.e. we're looking at house expense. But now we have basically just a very simple registry-style view of what are my transactions, and I want to go ahead and look at them line by line and zero in. Perhaps these two mortgage payments are of interest that happened back in March. Why were there two in March, for example? I also have a register by date. So basically various different supporting views besides the default detail view. So to kind of summarize this first example, the key concepts here were to create an interaction that allows very fast context switches from high-level information, top of the house, or segmented or categorical information. We're using KPIs to show on or off target, etc. And supporting detail views, this is kind of a mid-level because we're showing it by month with the timeline, and then we have the down on the details view below. As far as how this was accomplished, and the goal of this webinar, by the way, was not to go too much into the technical details, but show what's possible, what you can do with QlikView, and give you some ideas for your designs. But what we've done here is we've used a list box instead of a chart to create basically, again, this dual purpose component in our dashboard. So, as a list box, that's the standard QlikView object for browsing our attributes within our data. But many of you know that you can also add expressions to a list box, and you can cause those expressions to show up in interesting ways. So, for example, in the case of these indicators, we're representing them as traffic light gauges. And there's rules that we can bring in here and apply. One thing I'll point out, since I'm in this dialogue, and this will be a common theme in the next webinar as well when we talk about what-if analysis, rules start to get complicated, and what you can do to keep them a little bit simpler is you can start to use variables a lot. So we're looking at the code now that drives the colors. All of the colors you see in the dashboard are consistent. I actually used a tool, I think it might even still be open, QLER. It's a free site Adobe, and if you in your base color, it'll give you a set of complementary colors. I've selected a rule complementary. So basically I wanted to be able to choose some colors that match very nicely with this base color, and I came up with the sort of the bluish color by using this site. Again, it's QLER from Adobe. The point, though, is that once I've come up with these, I can plug them into variables and then use those variables throughout my dashboard. And what that allows me to do is not have to go into these charts one by one and update them if I need to make changes. I simply go to my settings and I can update the settings over here, and all of those changes will be reflected throughout the dashboard. So, and by the way, that applies to formulas as well. So take a look here. We have an actual formula, which is, you can think of it as business logic. Normally we'd have to hand type that in to any chart, but if we plug it into a variable, and this is what it looks like within the variable, we can actually refer to that business logic, and this can get very, this can really scale out. It can get very complex. We can actually pass in parameters to this formula so that it can have sort of dual purpose functionality, and we'll get into that in a different webinar or the next webinar when we talk about what-if analysis. The point here was centralized code as much as possible. So list box over here, the rest of these are just regular QlikView charts used in interesting ways. Okay, so let's look at some other examples. I put a couple of other quick ones together that help us visualize the data. Again, the goal being going from high-level information to low-level details as quickly as possible. Here's an example where we're just using a bar chart along with a line to show the budget. Now, the nice thing about this chart is using the plateau baseline to give it sort of a nice straight edge, so that these budget data points are almost light bars, but they're also nicely distinguished because they're just a simple line. But imagine if that were sort of a curvy or a diagonal line. It wouldn't look nearly as I think slick, or it wouldn't be as easy to work with as it is with this nice option that you have here in QlikView, which is the plateau. In fact, let's just look at the normal approach. This is what you would be dealing with if you had the default functionality plugged in. I'm going to hit undo on that. So that's a really simple example. This example here, I think everybody on the webinar has dealt with. These are called block charts in QlikView. Other tools call them tree maps. Really nice for understanding high level. Okay, what is the lay of the land within my data? There are some limitations. The key limitation with the block chart is that it's all proportional, so that you're not getting a real sense of the magnitude of a number within its in its own right, in its own sense. It's all based on the numbers that are next to it. It's showing proportions. So it's really good for understanding, okay, which segments within my data are important or are taking up the most volume. In this case, it's really obvious. It jumps out. Okay, it's the mortgage payment activity within house expenses. That obviously carries the most weight. But and let me just mention too, we're using color coding here as well, and that can be accomplished. Again, this is not supposed to be too technical, but just so you know where to do this, that can be accomplished within the background color expressions. So you can plug in an expression, and we're basically saying the warmer the color, the further off we are according to our plan. The cooler the color, in this case, the closer we are. In fact, this would mean if it's this blue color, as is the case everywhere else, that means that we are under budget. Now, the important thing I wanted to point out in this block chart is something I'm about to show you here. Block charts are normally used to give you, again, a high-level picture. You can do some drilling in. So let's say, for example, I click here on dining out. I've drilled into looking at Chinese food, alcohol store, French restaurant. So I have these. This would be the normal behavior. I'd have these segments. Now, what you're seeing below the segments, which look like basically comments, this is a custom sort of hack. And I think it's a really interesting way to use a block chart that I wanted to share in this webinar. Let me give you a better example of this. Let's say I click on alcohol store. Well, now I have, without having to move to any other charts, I have right here in this same spot all of the transactions that I can look at. So you're really sort of creating a dual purpose for what was originally intended as a way to organize your data into proportions, which by its very definition would mean higher level attributes within the data. Well, you've repurposed it to also give you low level information. So if we go to travel, for example, let's look at hotel. I have a couple of hotel transactions. I think one of the areas where we were off target quite a bit was dining out. So let's see, I think looks like Chinese food is one of the bigger offenders here. And here's all of the times we've had Chinese food. So again, the concept here, repurposing a block chart to also make it a detailed view of your data. As far as how that was accomplished, again, it's a little bit of a hack, and we won't go into the details because we don't have time for that. And it's not really in the scope of this webinar, but you can take advantage of the AGGR function, the agr function within QlikView, to basically create a detail level view of the data that would only come into play at certain intersections of your data. In my case, I've said whenever we get to the description level of our data, I want to actually bring out all of the detail records and display them. So it's acting as a dimension in this case in the block chart. If you want more information on this, feel free to send an email with a question after the webinar, and I'd be happy to provide some details on as far as how to make this work. Okay, so let's look at house expense for a minute here and look at the chart above. In this case, this is very similar to the view that I showed you here, except for it's a little more visual. So what we did here, just a reminder, is we sorted the transactions based on highest to lowest. And of course, you can't do that individually within each column. It has to happen globally across the whole set. So mortgage payment across all of the months was the highest contributor, followed by condo fees, etc. Over here, we've now put it to a nice little visualization, and so you can see, okay, really it was, I was totally within my budget, but then starting here in these transactions, house and tools, it looks like I started to surpass my budget. Let's look at some other examples of that. Yeah, dining out seems to have some really good ones. So, I was okay with my Chinese food and my Japanese food, etc., but then these others really blew me out of the water. Again, this is sort of an interesting approach. It's a soft data point, but take it for what it is. It's just another way to create some story behind the data to make it easy to track what's happening. Okay, so now that we've looked at the two pages of examples of visualizing the actuals versus the budget, and let me just point out one last thing on this page in case you're interested. This was accomplished using a feature in QlikView called Trellis. So basically the Trellis chart takes what is the month-year attribute and creates a separate chart within one larger chart where all of the axes are aligned. It's also called the small multiples view when you're talking about visualizing data. That's just the standard industry term. Very powerful chart. It's nice because you can see across the board Chinese food versus Japanese, segmented by month. Okay, let's look at some projections now. So we can look at some other interesting aspects of visualizing the data, as well as a way that you can create a nice interaction for the end user. In this case, we have basically a planning tab, and we want to basically figure out, given X dollars saved per month or invested per month, where will we end up Y years from now? And let's not only do that, but let's also set a goal and track this what-if capability. And this is a very simple example of what-if analysis that we'll look at today. Let's track that according to our goal and see what happens as we manipulate using this slider. So here's our goal. It's $2 million. We also have put some parameters around that goal. We want to reach that goal by the age of 55. So that's our goal. This is the actual that we would reach it. So we would get there by the age of 60, given our current investment of $750 per month. Now, before we go into this too much, let me just point out QlikView has a lot of good functionality for projections and forecasting, etc., or statistical analysis. In this case, we're using a future value function and just plugging in the parameters. One of those parameters includes what is the slider that we saw down below, which is our deposit amount. That's a variable. But QlikView has, last time I checked, it had roughly 50 different statistical functions that can be plugged in, and there's quite a few projection functions within that functionality as well. So that's how it's being done, is with an appropriate function that takes certain data points from our actual data as well as a variable. The variable is connected down here, and now what we can do is change our input. So if we were to invest $1,000 per month, we would get there 1 year after our desired age of 55. We'd get there at the age of 56. Again, we'd reach that $2 million point. You're seeing a little bit of red. Again, this is going back to that concept of information density, getting as much information as possible without sort of overloading the viewer. The red indicates that we haven't necessarily met our goal because there's a spot here where we went over our desired age of 55, and so that shows up as red. If we were to go up a little bit further, we're going to see some blue in here because that means we've actually surpassed our goal now. So again, just using colors in interesting ways, colors can create another level of dimensionality to your data. Okay, so off to the right, and again, there's some interesting things around placement here. Off to the right, we have some high-level figures. I've already talked about some of those, but it's also important to let the user quickly see the details, and so we have those as well close on. Here's all of our projection years, starting with the current year. This data set was populated with 2011 data, so that's our first data point. But what we can do is roll that forward, and we can even, of course, export this into Excel if we wanted to, once we've come up with the proper model that we're interested in, and we have all of those figures available. So that's basically what I had planned for today's webinar. What I'd like to is leave some time for any questions that might be out there. There's two ways you can ask a question. You can either type it in, or we can I can go ahead and try unmuting you. Last time we tried this, we got some feedback. Let's just see how that works out. I'm going to go ahead and try unmuting and see if we can allow some questions.